As you know, I've had an interest in both freedom of speech and freedom of religion for some very long time now. And I wanted to just put out a brief commentary on my concerns. If you remember when Obama was president and afterward, as Hillary ran her campaign, there were some terms that were loosely cast around. One of them was freedom of worship, and the other was freedom of religion. And Hillary had made some statement about supporting freedom of worship. And there were people that were concerned because they didn't feel that she was affirming freedom of religion when she was doing that. That may or may not have been the case, but the issue itself is pertinent today. Freedom of worship means that as a believer in any given religion, you are free to worship that religion in your church and perhaps in your home setting, but you are not free necessarily to express those religious beliefs in the wider society. Freedom of religion, however, says that you may both believe what you believe, worship it in your house of worship, and allow those beliefs to be acted out in the world around you. So freedom of worship is somewhat limited, while freedom of religion is much more expansive. This is pertinent because England, which often precedes the United States in terms of culture and mores, has been dealing with this issue for a while. There was a 2010 case which rather famously held that an individual had the freedom to worship, but not necessarily to practice their faith in public. This was recently demonstrated in a legal case against a physician who was fired from his position with NIH and had to change his area of expertise and begin working in an emergency room. In July of 2018, Dr. David McCareth was questioned about his religious beliefs in regard to gender identity. When questioned, he said that he would not be willing to use pronouns or affirm that somebody was a female if indeed they were a male. So based on his comments to an investigator, if you will, he was discharged from his work position and eventually took the NIH to court. The hearings established, unfortunately, that the doctor was perfectly free to have his own particular religious views, but those views could not in any way, shape, or form come into the public sphere. So while he was at work, he needed to affirm transgenderism. That really amounted to the fact that on paper, your Christian beliefs are protected, but in practice, they are not. The problem then continued to develop because the courts said that Christianity was essentially incompatible with a civilized society, and that, of course, is somewhat of a problem. More recently, there's a 46-year-old social worker, a Christian social worker, who had problems going through his social work program because it was known to fellow students that he was a conservative Christian, and he was actually removed from the program, was able to convince them that, yes, he was a Christian, but he never would discriminate against anybody, but he had his personal beliefs. And he was accepted as the best candidate for a job at a hospital as a social worker. And when the hospital looked at his social media and investigated his past, they discovered that he was a conservative Christian, and they brought him in again and put him through an interrogation about his religious views. They refused to honor their contract to hire him, and in essence told him that because of his faith and his beliefs, he was not suitable for employment with the NIH, because if anybody had knowledge of his beliefs, who was LGBTQ or whatever, that they might be made uncomfortable, and therefore it would be a problem. So we have an example in this of what we would call freedom of worship that now exists in England. That is, as long as you don't say anything about your belief system, and as long as you don't take it anywhere and it doesn't show up at your workplace, you are perfectly free to believe whatever you want to believe. But should your beliefs intrude into the public sphere, then you are not suitable as a candidate for employment. And this has considerable impact and is currently being debated and discussed in England, because the ramifications would be that, at least in theory, any Christian who has conservative religious beliefs may be at risk for being unemployable because their belief system might make somebody uncomfortable. There doesn't even need to be overt discrimination in this case. There simply has to be the knowledge of the fact that you hold the beliefs that you hold. So I mentioned this in order to point out that we in America need to be careful that we don't begin to think that our faith needs to be separate from the rest of our life. We believe firmly not only in freedom of speech, but in freedom of religion. And while we might say that freedom of worship is included in freedom of religion, we do not believe that freedom of worship is an adequate expression of faith in our culture. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, but you should keep your ear to the ground, because it's possible in the future that this may affect people with conservative Christian beliefs.